Great. My name is Ashley Lance, and I am a senior associate with Griffin Hammis Associates, and you are participating in webinar 4 of 5 of our benefits planning webinar series. Today, we are going to be focusing on supplemental security income benefits and focusing on the work incentive. So if you remember from our previous webinar, we talked about supplemental security income, or SSI, and we talked about the automatic work incentives. And so we're going to be talking about specialized work incentives in this webinar. I do want to remind you that by participating in this series, it in no way makes you an expert in this content. The experts are at your Utah Work Incentive Planning and Assistance Project, also known as UWIPS, which is housed within your vocational rehabilitation office. So it's really important that you access those professionals and experts in benefits planning when you have further questions. And yeah, just know that you're not leaving this series as an expert and not intended to be. The real intent of providing you with this information is so that you can really decipher between the two benefits and know and confidently know that work and benefits absolutely can go together, and that oftentimes folks are getting ahead. They have more money in their pocket, and that the more accurate information that we provide around benefits, the more realistic it is that folks will pursue employment, because a lot of times that fear is in addressing benefits. So again, the intent is just to give you some information to be able to more confidently have conversations with folks who are pursuing employment and receiving benefits, and to connect them to the experts at UWIPS. Okay? So today we're just focusing on SSI and specialized work incentives. So I want to remind you that SSI, in terms of our conversation, is all about the adult SSI benefit, okay? Not the children's benefit, not Title II, specifically SSI. And then we're going to walk through these specialized work incentives, and we're going to talk about examples for each one. The work incentives that we're going to talk about today are the Student Earned Income Exclusion, or SEIE, the Impairment Related Work Expense, also known as an IRWE, the Blind Work Expense, known as a BWE, or the plan to achieve self-support, better known as PASS, because we love acronyms. We're also going to talk about 1619B and Property Essential for Self-Support, also known as PES. So as you complete the post-test for this series, it's really important that you maybe take a few notes during our webinar today, because a lot of the questions in the post-test are applicable to the content today. So let's dive into our first one. The Student Earned Income Exclusion is what we're going to talk about first, because when Social Security Administration is looking at work incentives under SSI, it's the first one that they're going to look at. And as a reminder, under the Social Security Administration house, we are specifically talking about SSI. So we're opening the door to that SSI room, and one of the work incentives is Student Earned Income Exclusion, and it's the first one that SSA looks at to see if it applies to the individual. So if you're working with anyone who's 21 and under, 22 and under, and has SSI and is working, they absolutely need to know about this Student Earned Income Exclusion. So this is really, really cool, and it's Social Security Administration's way of recognizing that when we support students to become paid employees prior to graduation, that skyrockets. It doubles their chances of being successful post-graduation, and SSA realizes that. So they also want to incentivize students to be working. And so with the Student Earned Income Exclusion, they say, SSA says the first $1,870 a student makes in a month, those earnings are excluded, right? So I have to have $1,880 in gross earnings before SSA counts that, and they only count $10 if it was $1,880, right? So they close their eyes to $1,870. I say that over and over because realistically, how many students do you know are making that much money, right? It's a huge work incentive. And that's up to $7,550 a year. Okay. So, and again, it's really, really important that you pay attention to what year we're in, and that if you're watching this webinar in 2020, that you check out SSA's website and you look up what's the student earned income exclusion for that year, because it changes every year. Okay. It's also, the student earned income exclusion is applicable January through December. So it's all year long. It's not just when the student, it's not during the school year, right? So even if they're working in the summer, that still counts. So it includes summer months if going to continue back with school in the fall, right? So if you're supporting someone who is working in a post-high program and they're coming back in the fall, that's going to count for them. So again, this is SSA's way of really encouraging folks to work. Eligibility for SEIE, I have to be under the age of 22 and regularly attending school. So I've provided you here with the link to the Red Book. I would highly recommend that each of you take some time, go to the Red Book. It's an awesome resource for you to reference back to after this series, and then also to just use as a resource moving forward. If you're like, oh, I remember that student earned income exclusion thing, but I can't remember the details, or same thing with PASS or whatever. So it really goes over everything that we're covering in this series. And then once you hit 22, so if I become 22 in May of 2019, then the student earned income exclusion is going to stop that following month, right? So it's going to be done as soon as I turn 22. So it does have an age limit. So again, I want to point out that it's the first exclusion listed on the SSI calc sheet, and we can provide that as a download. But as you're calculating, remember when we walked through those automatic work incentives in the last webinar, this would be an exclusion that's first listed to reduce that. So even before those automatic work incentives, because SSA says if you're working and you're under the age of 22, we just want to exclude that first 1,000, let's come back to it, $1,870 a month, right? And then money after that would then be calculated, but otherwise they close an eye to that. So it's also so you're probably wondering, okay, well, I have a student who's doing this. I have a student who's doing this. Would this count as school? So it means regularly attending school in a variety of different ways. It could be a college or a university. They just have to be going 8 hours a week. Traditional school, so that means I'm grade 7 through 12, 12 hours a week. It could be a combination of school and a training program. So it absolutely would include post-high programs. So any of you participating in the school to work program, if you have students who are participating, that educational component would absolutely count for the student earned income exclusion. Students who might be homeschooled or homebound, and all of this is straight out of the Red Book and SSA's language, or even online schooling. So for students who are being homeschooled and taking classes online or taking online classes through a college or university, all of those things would count. So the idea is that because you are going to school, that you're going to gain more skills and become working, and that you'll be less reliant on benefits in the future. So you'll notice that all of these work incentives, they really want you to be less reliant on the benefits. And SSA says if you'll, say that you want to work and become less reliant on these benefits, we want to encourage you to do so. So really the intent of SSA is to be encouraging around work rather than discouraging. With the student earned income exclusion, it's also important that you share with students that they will oftentimes need to report their student status to Social Security Administration. So we can't assume that SSA just knows that they're aware of Joe being a student. So the verification is fairly simple. It could be your school ID card, it could be a tuition receipt, a calendar, a schedule. So they just really need to have documentation that they are in school. And the nice thing is that student earned income exclusion, if SSA misses it, folks can get back pay for that. So that's a really nice thing as well. So let's take a look at an example. So Pete is 20 years old. He's participating in a Senior Plus program or a post-high program at his high school. He recently gets a part-time job making $1,000 a month. Does Pete qualify for the student earned income exclusion? Yes or no? And Pete absolutely does apply for the student earned income exclusion, right? Because he's also below that threshold amount, right, for 2019. So SSA is just going to close their eyes to that first $1,000 or the threshold amount, but it's under that. So he's going to have his $1,000 plus a full SSI check. So that's over $1,700 in Pete's pocket, right? For a high school student, for a young adult, that's fantastic, right? So really, again, the whole intent behind the student earned income exclusion is to really encourage folks to work. All right, let's move on to our next work incentive. The next work incentive that we're going to talk about is the impairment-related work expense, or IRWE. And so you may remember this term from webinar 2, where we talked about the impairment-related work expense and as it applies to a Title II benefit. So very, very similar as it applies to SSI, but the calculation is a bit different, and we'll walk through that. So the nice thing about when you're applying an IRWE to SSI is you get to keep more of your SSI when you're paying for certain expenses. So here's the commonality between the two IRWEs and the benefits. The expenses have to be paid out of pocket by the beneficiary. That doesn't change. They're paying out of pocket. Me, Joe, is the beneficiary. I'm either writing a check out of my Joe bank account. I'm paying for it. Not mom, not dad, not grandma, not my staff. It's coming out of my bank account. And then I have to need it for an impairment. It has to be related to my disability. And then it also has to support me to work. I have to have it to be able to work. And it has to be at a reasonable price, right? So it's got to be comparable, reasonable, just not top of the line, right? But kind of middle of the line, okay? So the amount of the expenses paid can be deducted as part of the SSI calculation. And we'll walk through the calculation here real quick. And it can potentially get up to about half of the amount back in your SSI check. So if I'm paying $200 for something, I'll get about $100 back in my SSI check. Also, the IRWE has to be approved by Social Security Administration, and oftentimes they may request doctor's notes to accompany this, but they're just asking for justification. And when I've supported folks to get IRWEs, having a conversation with the doctor has been very easy. They willingly provided the doctor's notes. And I personally didn't have the conversation with the doctor. I supported the individual and the family member in what to request from the doctor. And then they requested it and we got all of the documentation and then sent that into the claims rep. So that's important for you to know that if you want to support someone in utilizing an IRWE, that it would benefit them. You just have to make sure that they have that justification and that is approved by the SSA claims rep. So let's go ahead and look at an example. So we're going to start off looking at his earned income. So we're going to skip over step 1 because he doesn't have any Title II checks coming in or unearned income, okay? So we're starting with step 2, looking at countable earned income. And you'll first see that we're going to start with that $1,000, right? So he made $1,000. And then the next thing we want to look at is, does this individual apply for any student earned income exclusion? Nope, he's over 22, so student earned income exclusion wouldn't apply. Then we're going to look at those automatic work incentives, the general income exclusion, and the earned income exclusion. And he gets to use the general income exclusion here because, oh, excuse me, because he didn't use it in phase one or step one in the calculation, right? So we get to apply it here. So we take $1,000 minus 85, and then you'll see before we even get to that remainder, we get to also subtract the IRWI. So let's walk through that again. I start with $1,000 of earned income. Then next on my calculations sheet, I'd want to say, okay, does this person that I'm working with, does student earned income exclusion apply? Nope, for this individual it doesn't because they're over the age of 22 and they're not in school. Then the automatic work incentives apply, the general income exclusion and the earned income exclusion. So I would minus $20, minus $65, and then I also plug in the IRWI. So I subtract $285, which leaves me with a remainder of $715, and then I divide by 2. Okay, so that 1/2 disregard. So now my countable earned income is $357.50. So when I had just mentioned before that oftentimes an IRWI gets you about half of the amount back in your SSI check, well, that's because you subtract the IRWI amount and then divide by 2. So that's how you get to that. So what are some examples of IRWIs? Again, there's no exhaustive list, and for some of us who just want a black and white list, that makes us crazy. However, it's a really, really good thing because it means that it's a conversation, right? And that sometimes it's not just, yes, this counts and no, this doesn't. It's a conversation with the claims rep. So medications, if I'm paying for medications out of pocket, so for example, if I'm taking an anxiety med and maybe I'm paying out of pocket for a portion of that medication, I could use an IRWI and get reimbursed for a portion of that because if I don't take my anxiety medication and I go to work, I'm not going to be at my best and maybe I can't focus and maybe my anxiety overcomes me a little bit and I can't focus, right? So it's really important that folks could also consider that as an IRWI, right? So medications, job coaching. If I'm paying out of pocket for job coaching, say that I didn't have long-term support through Medicaid, but I needed a little bit of job coaching for someone to just pop in and that I could talk to and kind of check in with once a month, and I'm paying out of pocket for that, that could be included. Medical devices, routine medical supplies, some transportation, that could be a whole other webinar, and then medical services as well. So the big question to ask is, do I need it for work? Does it have to do with my disability or an impairment? And is it reasonable, right? And then if so, then all of these could be a conversation to consider as an IRWI. So let's look at Pete. Pete is receiving SSI. He is not entitled to a Title II check. Okay, so he's just an SSI beneficiary. He's only receiving an SSI benefit. He recently gets a job making $1,000 a month of gross wages. He pays out of pocket for medications and blood tests every month for $200 due to his diagnosis. Could Pete consider the $200 in expenses an IRWI? Absolutely, yes. So because, again, let's go back, Pete pays out of pocket for the medication and blood tests, and he needs them for work. It absolutely could count. Another example, my sister wears glasses. Her glasses, she absolutely needs them for work, and the reason she has glasses is due to her diagnosis or her disability. And so she is able to use an IRWI for her glasses when she purchases those once a year, or if her eyes change. So that glasses could also be an example, but remember it has to be tied to the diagnosis that the individual is being treated for. So the next one is the blind work expense. And so this is specifically for that group of people that SSA says you meet our blind requirement, right? So they have to be deemed by Social Security Administration that, yes, you meet the statutory blindness requirements under SSA in order to use the blind work expense. So same intent, right? You get to keep more SSI when paying for work-related expenses. And again, it's only available for folks who are blind by SSA standards. Same thing applies. It has to be paid out of pocket by the beneficiary. It has to enable the beneficiary to work, and the amount of expenses can be deducted in the SSI calculation. But the difference with the blind work expense than the impairment-related work expense is folks get the entire amount back in their SSI check. And we'll look at the calculation, and that'll make sense for you. Also, the blind work expense examples are much more extensive than IRWI. So they can include state and federal taxes, union dues, mandatory pension contributions, guide dog, childcare, transportation, meals consumed during work, reader services, and this is just a small amount. So it absolutely is a benefit for folks to utilize the blind work expenses because, one, they can include a lot of things and they get the full amount of the expense back in their SSI check. So how can that be? Excuse me. Well, in step 2, the big thing is I apply the blind work expense after I divide by 2, right? So remember, with the impairment-related work expense, I add that in, or I subtract that out of my earned income before I divide by 2. With the BWE, or the blind work expense, that comes after you divide by 2. So let's look at a quick example. I have $1,000 of earned income. I first want to see, does the student earned income exclusion apply? The answer is no, because this person is 30 years old and not in school. So then I would apply the general income exclusion, the earned income exclusion, because I didn't use the general income exclusion in step 1. So I get to lob off $20, lob off $65. The remainder is $915. I divide by 2, $457.50, and then I put in the blind work expense, and now my countable income is $257.50. So that makes for a much larger SSI check by utilizing the blind work expense. And if you have questions, please just make sure you email me, and I can include my email at the end of the webinar. Let's look at our next work incentive. The next work incentive I want to talk to you about is the Plan to Achieve Self-Support, or the PASS plan. The whole intent of the PASS plan is that you get extra SSI to pay for food and shelter while you're using your own money or unearned monies to pay for work expenses to become more self-sufficient. So we'll talk about an example here. But essentially, remember, SSI is a needs-based benefit, right? And so when I have a needs-based benefit, remember how we've talked about any other money coming in reduces my SSI check. So what SSA is saying, you can set aside that unearned income, or what's reducing your SSI check, you can set that aside in what we call a PASS plan. And while you do that, we're going to increase your SSI to the full federal benefit rate so that you can pay your bills, your food and your shelter, while you're saving your unearned income, or it could be wages, aside to save for a work goal. The part about the PASS plan is it also has to be for a work goal. It has to help me become less reliant on SSI in the future, okay? So also, money in the account must be used to pay for, again, the specific work goal and very specific approved expenses, okay? And that's also what the money I set aside in the PASS plan is excluded from that resource limit, that $2,000 resource limit. So I could have a PASS plan that, might have $12,000 in it to help me purchase a used car so that I can work more and become less reliant on benefits because I don't have to adhere to the public transportation schedule that's available to me because I would have a car and I could drive. So again, the goal is very, very specific. It's a 15-page application. SSA really pushes folks, if I'm completing a PASS plan to apply to use a PASS, it really asks me to think about each single step. So for the example of a car, that would include insurance, maybe gas for this first 6 months. It would include shopping for the used car, getting my license if I don't have my license yet, and all of those expenses. So every single, it's almost like you have to dive into a task analysis for the goal that you want to accomplish, okay? So again, the intent of the pass is I get SSI or increased SSI to cover my living expenses. And the goal must eliminate the need for Title II or SSDI or significantly reduce my need for SSI, okay? And we'll look at an example here in just a second. Also, it needs to be time limited. I can't have a pass for 20 years. Oftentimes, I would say in general, passes are usually around 2, maybe 3 years, could be 12 months, but it's time limited, right? Because the intent is that I'm setting aside this extra money to work towards a work goal, and that work goal, when I achieve it, is going to help me work more. The more I work, the less reliant I am on SSI because I'm going to be making more money. Okay, so let's look at a neat example here. So the cool thing about PASS is that for beneficiaries who are a concurrent beneficiary, so that means, so I'm going to ask you to creep open the door to Title II benefits. But if I'm a concurrent beneficiary, which means I receive a Title II check and an SSI check, I'm essentially a perfect candidate for PASS. So if you're working with someone as a job developer, consider PASS as resources that folks could really be creative and maybe bringing, if they need to purchase tools for the job, that they could use a PASS plan to purchase tools. We've helped folks set up PASS plans to purchase a car. So again, if you're working with someone and you know that they receive both benefits, they're already receiving unearned income, right? That unearned income is reducing their title or their SSI check, right? So if I put my SSDI check into the bank, less $20 because I use the general income exclusion, right? So I set aside my Title II check minus $20 into a separate bank account, and this would be all approved by Social Security Administration. Then they're going to increase my SSI check to the full federal benefit rate. So then I have to make sure I can live off of my full federal benefit rate SSI check plus $20 from the general exclusion. And I set aside that Title II money to add up into my goal, right? So, and I can be spending money out of that PASS account on those specific items that I've been approved by a SSA to purchase those items, right? So for the example of, here's a woman we supported who had the opportunity to pretty much work full time. However, it was split shifts during the day. And so she couldn't work full time unless she was able to have a car, right? If she relied on public transportation, she realistically only could work part-time because that was what was available to her. So she applied for a PASS plan because she had wages and she also had a Title II check. And so she was able to set aside her Title II check and her wages to add up to be able to purchase a car. And she was also able to get a loan. So she technically used the PASS plan to pay back the loan. But her SSI covered her living expenses while she was saving up for the car. Now she's working full time because she can work both shifts and not rely on public transportation. So she's not receiving SSI the last time I checked. This was an example from years ago, so I'm not sure where she's at now. But the cool thing is, right, is that it really encourages and supports folks to become less reliant on their benefits because they can set aside money for anything that would help them go to work. So that could be for college expenses, it could be for a car, it could be for equipment that would help this person work. It could be for, again, a variety of things. We could do a whole other webinar also on PASS and examples of PASS plans. So one of the things to know is that when you're filling out, if you want to look at this link, www.ssa.gov/forms, SSA-545, that is the PASS plan application. So an SSA provides very detailed instructions on how to fill out the PASS plan form. And then each area or each region has someone called a pass cadre or a pass specialist, and they review all of the pass plans that come in. And the last time we checked, Utah doesn't have a pass plan. So I encourage all of you to help Utah get their first pass plan, because that would just be awesome, right? Because we know that folks are working towards an awesome work goal and they have a pass plan. So your person is in Murray, Utah, and they cover a variety of states. So Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, South Dakota. So they cover a pretty large region. So they're busy folks, but know that when you fill out that pass application, that's where it would go to. So what are some examples? Tuition, self-employment startup costs. So if I'm interested in self-employment, I could use a pass plan to help me set aside startup costs. It could be resource ownership or equipment or tools. So for example, if I'm working with a business and I ask them in that informational interview, for any of you who've been through our discovery training and customized employment training with Griffin Hammis Associates, you've heard us talk about resource ownership. So that would be an example where maybe I use a pass plan to save some money for a specific piece of equipment that would benefit this business. And the piece of equipment comes with me as the employee, but that piece of equipment helps that business increase their bottom line, essentially. So that might be, for example, someone who brings a coffee roaster to a coffee roasting company, right? So the examples are wide and large because many things could fit into that. So also it could be a vehicle. So all in the big piece and the red lettering is remember the goals to reduce or eliminate needs for SSI or Title II benefits, right? So a pass is never going to get approved if you can't significantly show how you're going to be less reliant on SSI or eliminate the need for the Title II benefit. Okay, so again, it has to help you become less needy on those benefits. So let's take a look at our next work incentive, 1619B. So 1619B is a really cool work incentive because it helps folks keep access to their Medicaid. So if you remember right, that SSI, again, is a needs-based benefit. And if you go way back to webinar 1, you remember that SSI, in that room, they're married to Medicaid. So SSI and Medicaid go hand in hand. So if I have access to Medicaid, oftentimes, or that my eligibility for SSI, I oftentimes want to keep that check so I can keep my access to Medicaid. And I want to let you know that this can be very state specific. So if you have someone that you think could be a candidate for 1619B, it is incredibly, incredibly important that you reach out to the professionals at UWIPS, because they really need to be involved, because the state rules and the federal rules can get a little messy. And it happens, right? But it's really, really important that, again, if you, after hearing the information about 1619B and you think that somebody could benefit from this, connect to the folks at UWIPS. All right, so here's what 1619B is. If I have enough earned income that causes my SSI check to balance out, to be zero, right? Donut hole. I'm not getting an SSI check because I have enough earned income that it's balancing it out. And so my initial thought is, ooh, I'm going to lose my Medicaid. 1619B is protection that even if I balance out my SSI check, I still get to keep my Medicaid. Right? So it's a lifeline for folks. So I'm not terminating from the benefit if I balance out my check. That's really important to know for folks. So I get to keep my Medicaid, and then if for any instance that I lose my job or I have less hours and my earned income isn't as high, my SSI check just kicks back in. A few months behind, remember, because SSA moves a few months behind. But it's really important that folks can still keep that access to Medicaid. So the eligibility criteria is that I have to have received SSI the month before 1619B would start, right? So I have to be using my SSI check and meeting eligibility. I also have to have a need for Medicaid, right? So, but for the example of my sister who uses her Medicaid dollars to help her live independently, to help her, so she has residential support, she has vocational supports, she has medical supports, and Medicaid covers all of those expenses for her, right? So she has to have Medicaid. But if she were to balance out or zero out her SSI check, 1619B would make sure that she still has access to Medicaid to help her live and work independently. So it's really important that folks know that 1619B is intended to be a protection of Medicaid, and that federally, that federal law trumps the state law. So again, I can't encourage you enough that you have to talk to the folks at UWIPS if someone needs to use that 1619B protection. Also, I have to continue to experience a disability. I have to continue to meet that definition, right, that we talked about in webinar 1. I have to meet the definition of disability. And then continue to meet the resource limit and SSI non-financial eligibility criteria as well. So I have to continue to meet the eligibility for the benefits. And then there is an earning threshold. So for the state of Utah, that means if I make $34,000, I can still have access to 1619B. But the threshold amount is $34,486. So, and that amount also changes every year. So if you want to figure out what that is or what it's been in the past or what it is this year, you just Google SSA 1619B protection and threshold, and then it'll take you to an SSA webpage and you can see what the threshold amount is for every state. So it does vary depending upon what state that you live in. Okay, so that is 1619B in a nutshell. Again, with any of these work incentives, I highly recommend that you connect with the folks at UWIPS. And if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to me or my colleagues at Griffin Hammis as well. So let's look at our final work incentive, which is property essential for self-supports. And this is one that really is beneficial for folks who are self-employed. So again, if you're also supporting someone who is self-employed or pursuing self-employment, also good to get your UWIP folks involved as well. So this would be resources that are essential to a person's business. So that business is their means of self-support, right? If I don't have my business, I'm not working, right? So it says that the resources that this person uses to operate their business are excluded. So remember that $2,000 resource limit, and you're thinking, oh, well, if I own a business, I'm certainly going to have more than $2,000 of resources in my business. So how do I continue to maintain SSI? You do that by using property essential for self-support, or PES, because it says those resources are excluded and that you can have more than $2,000 in resources if it's in a business account. The deal is it has to be a sole proprietorship, okay? So this means that property excluded regardless of value or rate of return. So what could be applied is property used in a trade or a business, property used by an individual as an employee for work, could be property required by an employer for work, and resources or property that must currently be used to be considered under PES, right? So there's always some rules around it, right? And if you have questions about PES, because we're really kind of flying over it, please feel free to email me. So let's look at an example, because I think it makes more sense with an example. So M is a business owner who runs M's Coffee Company. She needs certain equipment to run her business, such as an espresso machine, a coffee grinder, industrial sinks, a fridge, and a convection oven. So she needs all of these things to be able to make great coffee drinks, to bake pastries, to serve pastries, to refrigerate items such as milk, right, which is pretty important for a coffee shop. And these items all add up to thousands of dollars, right? Way over $2,000. But due to PES, or property essential for self-support, M doesn't need to worry about those resources impacting her SSI, right? So she still has access to SSI, she still has access to Medicaid, and she has thousands of dollars worth of equipment that help her operate her business, as well as the thousands of dollars or the few thousands of dollars that she has to have to operate her business also are safe, right? So she's got to be able to pay employees. She has to be able to purchase product. So she always has to have a certain threshold of amount in her bank account. And so PES protects that really and allows her to have more resources because of that work incentive. So it's a good thing. So we're going to summarize quick, and then again, if you have any questions, because this is recorded, please feel free to reach out to me and also connect with your professionals at UWIPS. So the cool thing is with SSI, there are multiple work incentives, right? And the great thing is folks can use multiple work incentives. My sister uses IRWI and PES, right? So she can use more than one. Folks can use the student earned income exclusion. They can use an IRWI and a PASS account, right? So again, you can use multiple work incentives, and it also doesn't mean that everybody has to use work incentives, right? It needs to make sense for that person and be individualized, just like all of the services that we provide and being individualized and meeting folks where they're at. Benefits are the same way. So you may leave this webinar and think, man, I got to get everybody I know on a PASS plan. But it really needs to make sense for that person, as well as an IRWI, as well as PES, as well as 1619B. So again, make sure that they're individualized. And that, again, not all work incentives work for all people, right? So you kind of got to assess and help somebody decide what makes sense. Or just turn your ear on, right, to listen for those opportunities where someone could really benefit from using an IRWI. And it comes through in conversation, maybe during that check-in point when you're saying, hey, you've been working, how are things going? Do you have any questions about benefits? How have benefits and work been going? Have you been reporting your income? Oh, yeah, everything's been great. But I just went to the doctor and found out that my anxiety med is not going to be covered by insurance anymore. So I've got to pay out of pocket for that. And then your ear turns up and says, ooh, I remember learning about an impairment-related work expense. And I think, let's connect you to the folks at UWIPS, but I think that you could use an impairment-related work expense to help cover what you're paying out of pocket for that medication, right? So that's really where this stuff comes into play, is you turning on your ear and listening for those opportunities and providing folks with accurate information and accurate referral information to folks to get support around benefits and employment. So even if additional work incentives aren't in use, again, folks still financially get ahead. So even if I don't touch any of these work incentives, I still get ahead, right? I still have more money in my pocket, right? And also with an IRWI and a BWI, just remember that folks can get more money in their pocket. So also, if the income, if it's a really high income and low expenses amount, it also may not be able to get any extra SSI back too. So again, some of the story is it's individualized, right? Everything we do is individualized. So I hope that you took some notes and remember the work incentives, and just that work incentives can be used for a lot of folks in a lot of different ways, and to be creative in it as well. So I leave you with that, hopefully being willing to think a little bit further outside the box, knowing that SSA really does want to encourage people to work and to have more money in their pockets. And so I encourage you to join us for our final webinar of this series, where we will talk about reporting income, talk about how you get in touch with the folks in your local state. So again, I encourage you to join us for webinar 5, and thank you so much for carving out time to be part of this series. And again, if you want to reach out, my name is Ashley Lance. I work for Griffin Hammis Associates. My email is alantz, so ALANTZ @griffinhammis.com. Thank you so much.